And that's a good question because it's an obvious question to ask when you think that the communications are so bad. So let's compare it to the next war. Let's jump on 20 odd years from the First World War to the Second World War. And in that war, there were men like General Montgomery, who'd fought in the First World War as a young officer, and he'd seen the problems on the battlefields. And he'd been a staff officer, so he knew how difficult it was to communicate. But in his war, because of the invention of things like radio, it was much easier for him to know what was going on. So if that had been there, radio existed in the First World War. The first radio sets that existed at the beginning of the war were massive. They were about the size of your school bus. Now, what can you do with that? You can't pop that in your pocket and take it into the trench. It's too big. So by the end of the war, they were much smaller. They were probably about the size of a radio set, a modern radio set that you listen to the radio on. And they could go inside an aircraft or a tank, but they could not transmit voice. They could only transmit Morse. So that's Morse code, ... which was slow. And it's not as instantaneous as in the same way that we're talking now. It's not as instantaneous. And radio transmission of voice only came into being after the First World War. The BBC pioneered it in the 1920s, for example. So that created a lot of problems. But if that technology had existed, then I honestly think that the battles of the First World War would have been very different. One of the back in the 1980s, I was lucky to interview over 300 veterans of the First World War, and one of them once said to me that if he could take any bit of technology back to the war through a hole in time, it wouldn't be a better weapon, it wouldn't be a bigger tank, it would be a mobile phone. Because that technology, the ability to instantly talk to people, would have transformed the battle, would have transformed the way that soldiers fought, and probably resulted in far fewer casualties.
Fantastic. Right, we're going to move on, Paul, to our next question, which is from Antia, I hope. There's Antia. Wave, Antia. There's Antia at the back.
Hi. My question is, was the British plan a waste of time?
She's asking, was the British plan at the Somme
A waste.
bad, or a waste? That she's using the term a waste of time.
A waste of time. Well, when you look at it from 100 years, it probably looks that way. But they were convinced that the Germans could be destroyed just by bombarding them with shells. So in 1916, if you went back to the previous year, they had a big problem in Britain with the production of shells. It was called the shell scandal, where not enough shells for the guns had been manufactured. So they changed that. And by the time of the Somme, there was a huge stockpile of artillery shells. In many respects, the Battle of the Somme was the first industrial battle of the First World War from a British perspective, because industry played a big part in providing the tools, the shells, equipment, the guns that were necessary to fight it. And they had so many of these shells that they believed that just by exploding all these shells on the German positions, nobody would survive, and all their men would have to do would be to walk into battle and occupy the enemy trenches, and they would be in the towns behind the German trenches by nightfall, Berlin by Christmas. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the reality was the Germans were dug in deep underground, in some cases as much as 80 feet beneath the surface. So that meant that the shells that were dropping on the surface damaged their trenches, smashed up their machine gun positions, their mortar positions, and so on. But the men were still alive, deep in their dugouts. And we didn't know the Germans had these dugouts. So we could never plan for that because we didn't know they exist. So when our men went into battle on that morning of the 1st of July, at 7:30 in the morning, perfect summer's day, perfect visibility. And they thought they would just come out of their trenches, walk across the grass in no man's land and get to the smashed German trenches, and almost the war would be over. But the Germans had survived. So they came up out of their dugouts very quickly, set up their rifles, set up their machine guns, and our men walked straight into that fire. And what that meant was that you could throw as many shells as you want at a German trench, but unless you killed the men who defended that trench at the same time, if they survived, the result was always going to be the same, that your men, having come out of the cover of their trench, walked across the battlefield, would be exposed, and then would get cut to pieces by rifle and machine gun fire. So the plan looks ridiculous from 100 years, but because of the failure of intelligence, because of going back to the whole aspects of communication we spoke about earlier, it was a plan fit for its purpose on the day based on what we knew. And the real crime would have been if we'd have done nothing except fight that plan again and again and again, if we hadn't adapted the way we did things. And that's what you see in the Battle of the Somme, is a change in tactics. We don't just send men into battle over the top in broad daylight and hope for the best. We try to find better ways of fighting. And although that costs lives, by the end of the Battle of the Somme, we're fighting a very different war to the one we'd fought at the beginning.
Fantastic. Antia, anything to add to that, or any other questions? Or does anybody want to add anything to that? Ask anything? Are we moving on? We're moving on. We're moving on. Nacho. Nacho has a question. Here's Nacho.
Hi, Nacho.
Hi, Nacho.
This question goes back to the causes of World War I. Who do you think has the blame to the beginning of World War I?
Who do you think is most to blame for starting the war?
Well,
Nice, easy question for you there, Paul.
That's
a really good question, and that is something that the First World War, the outbreak of the First World War was 103 years ago, and historians are still arguing about who caused the war to this day. In 2014, a lot of books came out about this with a lot of different answers. And after World War I, the blame was put firmly on the Germans, that Kaiser Wilhelm in Imperial Germany had built up a huge stockpile of armaments. There'd been an arms race, and it had led to war. That the creation of essentially two armed camps within Europe, Germany allying itself with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the French and the Russians allying, had created these two armed camps with a lot of tension that somehow would lead to war. Now, in that respect, I don't think there is any one country in my mind that is specifically to blame, because there was a huge amount of tension in Europe, and that tension was heading towards war one way or another. And in many respects, it was probably only a matter of time before there was some sort of conflict. Whether that conflict would just be local, because Germany, as you probably know, as you've looked at the causes, came about because of the Franco-Prussian War, when the state of Prussia, relatively small, attacked France, overrun France, occupied France, annexed Alsace-Lorraine, and that led to a surge in German nationalism and the creation of Germany. So there could have been a conflict like that again, but the fact that all these countries within Europe were tied together with treaties and alliances, that was the difference in 1914. So it meant that when one was attacked, the rest would go to their aid. And it was like having a big pile of cards and then pulling a card out of the middle of it, and the whole thing collapses. And that's exactly what Europe was like in 1914. That each country was a card in that pack, made into the pyramid, linked together by these treaties and alliances, but you remove one when one's attacked and the thing collapses. And Europe spiraled into war very, very quickly as a consequence of it. So I don't think one country is to blame.
If you had to pick one, Paul, which one would you go for if you had to pick one?
Well, Germany bears some blame because But is it blame? I mean, there'd been, if you go back 99 years to Waterloo, Prussia saves the day at Waterloo when we defeat Napoleon. And this led to this surge of Prussian nationalism that lasted for 99 years, with the annexation of Denmark, and then the wars against Austria, and then the war against France, and then the creation of the nation state of Germany. And that was only heading in one direction, that Germany wanted to be bigger, greater, and what it feared more than anything, Russia. That was its big enemy. In both world wars, Russia was the enemy of Germany. So if there was going to be any big...
We've got one Russian student here, Paul. We've got one Russian student as well. He's waving.
So, I mean, Russia was the big... Simply because of the size of Russia and the size of its army, it was greatly feared by the Germans. And the German generals, before the First World War, had looked at Imperial Russia under Tsar Nicholas and looked at this massive army that was really, really poorly trained and poorly equipped, but they saw that it was undergoing some degree of reform. And it was calculated that it would be equal to, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of ability, it would probably be equal to Germany by around 1917. And that's what Germany feared, is if the Russians were as good as them in the next couple of years, then what would stop Russia from attacking Germany? So in some respects, in 1914, you could argue that the Germans pushed Europe in the direction of war, to deliberately fight a war against the Russians, to stop the Russians from attacking them from the long-term point of view.